Hello, and welcome to the Capacity Building Center for States Introduction to the Center for the Study of Social Policy's Youth Thrive Framework webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the call over to today's host, Ms. Meredith Pachilli of the Center for States. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. At this time, all phone lines are muted. However, attendees will be able to ask any questions throughout the webinar using the questions pod to the right-hand side of your Adobe Connect screen. We will address these questions during the question and answer session at the end of the webinar, at which time you may also ask questions via phone by pressing *1. I would also like to direct your attention to the handouts pod to the bottom right of your screen, where you will see several handouts available for viewing and download. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Catherine Heath of the Children's Bureau.
Great, thank you. Let's move to the next slide. So it's with the great excitement that I kick off this webinar talking about the Youth Thrive Framework. I am Catherine Heath, and I'm at the Children's Bureau here in Washington, D.C., and I'm the National Youth Specialist for the Chafee Foster Care Independence Program. And I became aware of Youth Thrive's work a couple of years ago. We have several grantees from the Children's Bureau and several independent living programs that have really looked at the Youth Thrive Framework as a way to look at how to create a shift in culture to be able to appropriately serve young people. With that, I think this webinar is going to be an excellent opportunity to really learn more about what they're doing and what's happening. So with that, I'm going to turn it over.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. My name is Matt Hudson. I'm the Program Area Manager for Youth Development with the Center for States. I'd like to take this moment just to go over the agenda for you with what we'll be covering. I'm going to do some brief introductions, and then I'm going to go over an overview of the Child Welfare Capacity Building Collaborative. Then we'll move into an overview of the Youth Thrive Framework, and then finally we'll have a question and answer session at the end, as Meredith mentioned a few moments ago. So to introductions again, my name is Matt Hudson. I've been with the Center for States for about 7 months. And then prior to that, I actually have experience working with Youth Thrive as well in a couple of the states like Catherine mentioned. And then I've also been trained in their Youth Thrive curriculum, and I agree completely with her statements about what it's attempting to do to change the culture of how we work with our young people. The other two presenters in this webinar are going to be Susan Notkin, Associate Director at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and Francie Zimmerman, Senior Associate at the Center for the Study of Social Policy. So our objectives of this webinar today are to understand the Youth Thrive Framework and how it can be applied to working with the young people in child welfare. We'd also like to gain an understanding of the research behind the Youth Thrive Framework, identify the Thrive promotive and protective factors, discuss the importance of mitigating risk for our young people in child welfare, identify strategies that may help improve the well-being for youth and child welfare, and determine how the Youth Thrive Framework can be applied to their work with young people. And so before we go into some more detail about the Youth Thrive Framework, I'd like to give everyone on the call just a little bit more information about the Child Welfare Capacity Building Collaborative and this Capacity Building Center for States. In October 2014, ICF International was awarded a contract by the United States Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families Children's Bureau to establish the new Child Welfare Building Collaborative. The collaborative consists of the Center for States, the Center for Tribes, and the Center for Courts as partners and consolidates services that had previously been provided by the National Child Welfare Resource Centers. This consolidation increases coordination, leverages resources, and provides more strategic service provision. Our goals are to work with partners and jurisdictions to support capacity building to lead to improved outcomes for children and families. We do this by partnering with states, territories, tribes, and courts to identify, design, and implement innovative solutions that meet the unique needs of each jurisdiction. So that's the Child Welfare Capacity Building Collaborative. Those goals kind of encompass all three of the centers, states, courts, and tribes. But more specifically, our role as a Center for States, we serve state and territorial public child welfare agencies and Title IV-E waiver demonstration jurisdictions. The Center's Executive Project Director is Maggie Bishop, and ICF International supports the Center for States. You might recognize ICF from our work with the Child Welfare Information Gateway, as ICF has a long history of working on technical assistance contracts with the Children's Bureau and other government agencies. And so I don't want to get into too much detail, but that's a really quick overview. And if anybody that's listening has any more questions about that, at the end when we give you the contact information, feel free to email me any questions you might have about that. But without further ado, though, I'd like to turn it over to Susan Notkin and Francie Zimmerman to give you the overview of the Youth Thrive framework.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. And I want to thank the Children's Bureau and the Center for States for inviting us to speak with you today. Francie and I are going to be sharing, as Catherine mentioned, Catherine and I are going to be sharing with you the work that CSSP is doing to shift the prevailing narrative about youth from one that focuses on their deficits and limitations towards one that sees them as youth of opportunity with the potential to thrive. And we'll be sharing ideas and strategies that public intervening systems can use to ensure that young people in their care are given the best chance towards success and well-being and the realization of their goals and their realization of their aspirations. So the obvious place to start is with the Youth Thrive goal. And our goal is to ensure that all youth experience well-being with a particular focus on our country's most vulnerable youth, those in our child welfare, juvenile justice, mental health, and runaway and homeless systems. And we see Youth Thrive as a pathway for achieving well-being. So in 2011, I'm just looking at this. Okay. In 2011, as part of our work to address the, dismal outcomes that child welfare systems were seeing with the youth under their care, we conducted a synthesis of the research on adolescent brain development, the research on the impact of trauma and toxic stress on that development. We looked at the research on resiliency and on positive youth development. So when we talk about Youth Thrive, we're actually referring to two things. We're referring to both a framework that's based on that research that calls out 5 protective and promotive factors necessary for achieving well-being, and the name of CSSP's national agenda geared towards changing the way public systems interact, serve, and support young people. So as a framework, Youth Thrive applies to all youth. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about a youth who has enjoyed all the nurturance and opportunity in the world, or one who has faced significant adversity in their lives. What impedes their well-being, what enhances it, and what healthy adolescent development looks like are pretty much the same. They're universal. The framework, therefore, applies to all youth along the life course, starting at the age of puberty through the age at which the brain is fully developed, which is around age 26. Doesn't mean that the interventions won't change whether we're talking about a young person in early adolescence versus someone who is really at emerging adulthood, but the factors are the same. The characteristics of healthy development are the same. And as a national initiative, it addresses what 9 to 21-year-olds in intervening systems need in order to thrive. Since we're going to be talking more about protective and promotive and risk factors, let's start with some definitions. The first thing I want to call out is that all of these factors address conditions and attributes within the individual and within his or her family, community, and larger society. There are many forces beyond the individual qualities of at the individual level that at play that present great challenges to a young person's ability to thrive. I'm thinking about things like poverty, abuse, or barriers to opportunity based on race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. Our efforts need to view the youth in the context of all those forces, and our strategies need to address these realities when building on the inherent strengths within the youth. The second thing I want to point out is the distinction we make in the definition between protective and promotive factors. And for the purposes of this presentation and the way we talk about protective and promotive factors, when we talk about these things, these two things, we'll really be discussing conditions and characteristics that simultaneously mitigate risk and enhance well-being. So we don't talk about, oh, this is a protective factor and this is a promotive factor. We talk about them together. So this is our theory of change for the framework. And the framework identifies 5 protective and promotive factors that work to mitigate risk and enhance well-being. 4 risk factors that, if unchecked, will impede that well-being. And 5 outcomes of well-being that all of us can identify with. They're pretty much what all parents want for their children. And the theory that we hope is communicated through this visual is that simply focusing on reducing risks will not get us to positive well-being outcomes for youth. And unfortunately, that's where much of the focus has been in the past, where we've tried to control for risks without really focusing on what we need to do to build towards healthy development. And so what's needed is a coordinated set of strategies that works to decrease risk and promote health and well-being. And we'll be going into detail about the 5 protective factors in a moment, but let's first look at the larger context for this work.
Okay, hi everybody, this is Francie Zimmerman talking, and I'm going to do that look at the bigger picture that Susan alluded to. So let me just begin by saying, obviously we all know from our own personal experience that the transition into adulthood is intense. It's sometimes difficult, and it's genuinely exciting at the time in our lives. And in fact, we now know from research that the period of adolescence plays an outsized role in how we see ourselves and how we write our own personal stories over time. In fact, memory researchers have found that we remember more events from late adolescence and early adulthood than from any other stage in our lives. So, in thinking about how important this phase is, we wanted to take a quick look at a few of the macro trends that are part of the bigger picture context for youth today. Of course, one of the most disturbing facts, and Susan's already alluded to it, is the high rate of poverty for our youngest citizens. Children under 18 represent 23% of the population, but they comprise 33% of all people in poverty. And amongst our older children, let's say adolescents from 12 to 17 years old, 41% live in low-income families, 19% in very poor families. For the first time in 2011, babies born in America were majority minority children. That means that children of color, non-white children, now represent a majority of children under age 5. And as white baby boomers continue to age and our nation's children are increasingly Hispanic, African American, Asian American, the culture generation gap is growing. Older voters typically prioritize programs that benefit seniors, and even among parents, children's issues can sometimes take a secondary place to economic concerns. In addition to this age gap, there has historically been a large gender gap in which women express much stronger support for making investments in children than men. However, a positive trend is that as young men are taking on a greater share of child-rearing duties in families, that gender gap appears to be disappearing. Unfortunately, the general public often has a negative view and a lot of anxiety about young people, I think probably unlike most of us on this webinar. But we did want to highlight a few of the positive trends related to youth and hope these might be helpful to you as you talk to a wider audience. For example, this graph, which shows that high school dropout rates have been declining, and there has been a national increase in university enrollment attributable to an increase in the number of college students aged 24 and under since 2000. Here's another graph showing some good news. As the national campaign to prevent teen and unplanned pregnancy states, since the early 1990s, the United States has made extraordinary progress in reducing teen pregnancy and birth rates. In 2014, the teen birth rate reached a new record low, the lowest level reported in more than 6 decades. So, given the demographic shift, for our country to be strong and successful, clearly we have to also improve the lives and outcomes for all children and work harder to eliminate racial disparities. This illustration juxtaposes the reality of a white child going out to play and being reminded to simply put on his jacket, while a black child going out is being reminded of a long and somewhat disturbing list of precautions necessary just to try and stay safe. A critical part of our big picture is the persistence of racism, implicit bias, and the inequities and injustices that go along with that, whether we're talking about Ferguson in Baltimore, or these days lead poisoning in Flint, or specific to this conversation, the overrepresentation of children and families of color in our child welfare system. For those parents of teenagers who are on the webinar, you'll see that according to this diagram, there is a tiny corner of the brain that is actually responsible for chores and homework. But as you can see, it's crowded out by the more important priorities like love, rebellion, creativity, and of course, Facebook. But more seriously, during the past decade, our knowledge and understanding of what is going on in the adolescent brain has grown dramatically. One of the key insights from using imaging technology to see and study brain development is that we now know that adolescence represents the second great wave of brain growth after the first few years of life. Contrary to long-standing belief, the brain is not fully formed and set by age 5. While early experiences affect the quality of the brain's architecture, adolescence presents another period where experience and relationships impact the development and wiring of the brain, including the creation of new neural pathways. This process of pruning strengthens frequently used neural pathways and eliminates infrequently used connections. So as Susan indicated, Youth Thrive's initial area of focus is on young people who are involved in intervening systems, specifically the child welfare system, and now adding in juvenile justice. And this really reflects the center's long-standing commitment to address issues that affect the most vulnerable populations, and especially where there's a clear public responsibility and mandate and opportunity to put new ideas into action by reforming public systems. Youth and child welfare represent 40% of the children in foster care. 40% of the children in foster care are over the age of 11, and 1 in 3 children who enter care are age 11 or older. So if we look at the trends over the past decade, foster care numbers overall have been decreasing, but began to increase in 2011. Recent data in the Federal Child Maltreatment Report for 2014 shows an increase from fiscal year 2013 to fiscal year 2014 in referrals to CPS and in the number of children determined to be victims of child abuse or neglect. And we know that ACYF, states, and localities are examining the reasons for this shift and directing efforts to really try to be responsive to that. Youth incarceration rates have also decreased since 1999 by 41% nationally, and the decline in youth confinement occurred across all 5 of the largest racial groups, but large disparities remain in youth confinement rates by race. So this is my final sort of big picture research finding. Clearly, there are many, many powerful and compelling success stories of young people who have spent time in foster care. And I'm sure many of you on this webinar are connected to inspiring youth who are accomplishing great things in their lives. But we have to acknowledge that the overall picture remains troubling, to say the least. This is data from the Midwest study conducted by Chapin Hall. As many of you know, it's a longitudinal research study that followed a sample of young people from Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois as they transitioned out of foster care into adulthood and compared their status to youth in the general population. The findings give us a pretty comprehensive picture of how foster youth are faring, and as the researchers say, it is a troubled and troubling picture with much higher rates of school failure, unemployment, lack of health insurance, and homelessness. Clearly, we want and need to do better to help youth achieve positive results and to actually thrive into adulthood. Susan, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Francie. I want to make this, there we go. So what do we really mean by thriving? Well, Peter Benson from the Search Institute talked about thriving as a set of positive signs in adolescence, things like, academic success, caring for others in their community, being able to affirm their different identities, their cultural and ethnic and identities, and a commitment to healthy behavior. And it really represents the integration of the whole person. So we couldn't say that someone was thriving in their life if they were doing well in school, but they had a substance abuse problem. Focusing on thriving helps us to realize that our goal for youth is not just about the absence of negative outcomes. Instead, it should be driven by the goal to help youth engage their unique talents, their interests, and their aspirations. And it requires us to realize that our expectations for youth in care should be no different from our expectations for our own children. Finally, a focus on thriving is really closely aligned with several federal priorities. The extension of foster care to 21 recognizes that youth need more support before they're prepared to succeed in the world. The former ACYF Commissioner Brian Samuels, talked about how safety and permanency were necessary, but that they were not sufficient. And he really reanimated, I think, the conversation and the urgency around focusing for child welfare to be focusing on well-being. And the new federal law, which recognizes that children and youth must be afforded opportunities to participate in normal activities, also reinforces this focus on the whole child and making sure that youth thrive. So what are we doing to move the field forward toward realizing well-being? First, we're committed to translating the research and knowledge into action, into on-the-ground examples, strategies, policy changes, practice changes that really build on what the research tells us. Second, we're building and creating networks of champions made up of youth, practitioners, judges, and policymakers. And as part of that sort of network building, I think it was 2011 or 2012, we conducted a national search for exemplary programs and identified 15 very diverse initiatives from around the country that provide these on-the-ground examples of how to go about building the protective and promotive factors. And Francie and I will be weaving in examples from these programs throughout our presentation. Third, we've developed and are continuing to develop a set of tools and resources for the field. Working with the National Resource Center on Youth Development and the Academy of Competent Youth Workers, we developed a 3-day Train the Trainer curriculum on Youth Thrive and are currently developing a validated youth self-assessment instrument that youth and their workers can use to think about a youth's strengths and needs, and that can help them to craft interventions and supports to strengthen these protective and promotive factors. And finally, we're working with, right now, 7 jurisdictions across the country to use Youth Thrive as a lens through which to rethink their policies, programming, contracting, licensing, training, and practices so that they can better reflect what the research, tells us that youth need in order to thrive. So here's a listing. Let's see if it is a listing. There we go. Here's a listing of the places we're currently working, and I realize that the map is we're a little bit East Coast centric, not intentional, but we do know also that Orange County, California, and Hawaii are also using Youth Thrive to rethink their independent living programs and their supports for youth. This is the list. These are the list, and we're now going to be talking, going into quite a bit of detail on all of them. These are the 5 protective and promotive factors that synthesis of the research that I mentioned identified as necessary for helping to mitigate risk and to enhance well-being in young people. So let's start by talking about resilience. When you think about someone who's resilient, I ask you to take a second, because we're not going to pause really, but to think about, who do you think of? I think we all know people who have managed to function well despite experiencing huge life challenges. And I know I used to think about resilience as something you either were or weren't, as if it were some kind of personality trait. For a while there, everybody was reading about the resilient child, what we know is that resilience describes the process of managing stress despite having experienced significant adversity. And the research also tells us that resiliency isn't a personality trait, but rather something that can be cultivated and learned. Now, of course, personality plays a big role in determining how people react to challenges. But the research is also clear that when youth are supported by at least one caring adult, they have the ability to develop their resilience. And the key is to help you deal with the stresses they're confronted with, make sense of their past, exercise control over their lives so that they can become stronger and more resilient. But again, the key is it's a quality that can be built, it's a quality that can be nurtured, it's a quality that can be strengthened, and it's a necessary quality for being able to tackle life's challenges. So some examples. New Jersey's Department of Children and Families recently reworked its transitional living plan by requiring that youth, rather than workers, fill out the plan and identify their goals and plans and supports needed for reaching their goals. And it also provides an opening for youth to rethink their plans when goals haven't been met without making them feel like they failed. Our second example from Oregon, as their name I think suggests, the My Life Project uses the principle of self-determination to help young people transitioning from care learn how to direct their own lives. It's based on a model, an evidence-based program that had been developed for use with adults with developmental disabilities, and the My Life Project sort of adapted it for youth with transitioning youth. And what they do is they work with coaches, and the coaches help youth to set their goals, solve problems, rehearse strategies, take action, and request help. And perhaps I think for me, most importantly, and I think they would say, what they do is they encourage youth to learn from their mistakes and their choices, rather than trying to prevent them from making those mistakes in the first place. And finally, Just Like Me in Jacksonville connects some of the most vulnerable youth in foster care in that area, many of whom were trafficked or involved in the justice systems. And they connect these young people to trauma-informed volunteer artists and dancers and musicians from the community. And the program's goal is to provide youth with an opportunity to follow their interests and to write, sing, dance, paint, or make videos that tell their own stories. The idea is that through creative expression, the program helps youth capitalize and recognize their own strengths, acknowledge their challenges, manage adversity, and heal from the effects of trauma. And each young artist leaves with a product of their work and participates in a performance at the end to an audience of family, foster parents, staff, media, and community members. And the program results, a year after completion are pretty impressive, especially when you consider the challenges that these young people faced when they came to the program. 86% of the participants had obtained a high school diploma or equivalency degree. 87% had no juvenile or adult criminal justice system involvement, and 93% were not pregnant or parenting. The second protective and promotive factor is social connections. As children get older, their networks of support expand to include not only their parents. When they're younger, the parents are the be-all, end-all. They're often the only ones that children often have contact with, except for extended family. But as they get older, these networks expand to include other caring adults in their families, school, and community, as well as the importance of their networking with peers. What we know is that young people typically don't connect to programs, but rather to the people at programs and people in programs. And this points to the importance of our being able to form genuine, emotionally connected relationships with the youth we serve, which is somewhat different, frankly, from maintaining the kind of professional distance that many agencies encourage. The research is pretty clear that multiple positive connections with adults and peers increase the likelihood that the youth will thrive, and that having at least one caring, consistent adult in their lives is probably the most important thing for helping young people to experience well-being. Okay. I know that there is quite a bit of information on this slide. Connections, let's take it from left to right. Connections provide youth with a lot of things. Emotional support by being empathic, informational support by, for example, providing help in applying for college or getting a job. Instrumental support by providing hope and encouragement, instrumental support by providing things like transportation or food, and spiritual support by providing hope and encouragement. Social connections and the things that they bring to us are critical in promoting resilience and thriving. Unfortunately, many young people living in out-of-home care experience a long succession of terminated relationships that leave them hurt and unable to form normal relationships with others. By moving them from placement to placement, we unintentionally reinforce their belief that they're not lovable, that no one cares about them, and that no one will be there for them through thick and thin when they need support. And consequently, they often end up avoiding contact with us, showing anger, and challenging us. And what we need to realize is that these are all strategies for self-protection, and how we deal with them will either help the young person to heal or will reinforce their negative image of themselves. Now, knowing how important social connections are for youth's well-being, these three programs offer some strategies that are really worthy of note. Both Anew in Minnesota and Seneca in California work to ensure that youth are not further traumatized once they enter foster care by repeated moves and impermanence. Both employ strategies and train and recruit staff so that youth are able to remain in their first foster home rather than experience continued fracturing of relationships. In 2006, Anew set a pretty ambitious goal for themselves. They wanted to be the last placement prior to permanence for 90% of the youth that they served. And at the time, in 2006, only 38% of youth leaving Anew's foster care system services were charged to and were discharged to a permanent placement. By the next 6 months, by the first 6 months, last 6 months of 2012, that percentage had almost doubled to 70%, and it's increased since then. And their work is based on two key beliefs. The first is that youth's past trauma, grief, and loss has to be addressed in order for the youth to form lasting, meaningful relationships. And second, that the search for people who youth have loved and lost should be extensive and exhaustive. Seneca vows not to eject a youth for exhibiting the kind of behavior that brought them to the agency in the first place. And they also work diligently to connect youth with their kin and to maintain relationships with their family of origin. And New Jersey has recognized that a youth visit with their family should never be used as either a reward or punishment for bad behavior. I'm going to turn it back to Francie.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, so I'm going to cover the next three protective promotive factors. This one is the knowledge of adolescent development. And one of the things that's worth mentioning, just by way of background, is as the Center for the Study of Social Policy developed this Youth Thrive framework, we checked in with a number of youth advisors, and including holding focus groups with young people to get their reactions to these concepts and how we were talking about them and presenting them. And one of the things that Susan frequently shares is that the focus group with youth, where they talked about adolescent development and the new brain science, was really an aha moment for many of those young people who felt, I think, a tremendous sense of relief about what was going on with them developmentally, and that these changes and their internal dialogue going on during adolescence was very normal, and that they had these opportunities to continue to grow and change through this phase of their life. We want that kind of knowledge and understanding and insight into the dynamics of adolescent development to be part of young people's experience, so that that's information that they get, that their parents and other extended family get, that their foster parents get, that their workers know, and that they then see ways to use that understanding and insight to promote healthy development. Susan's already mentioned the impact of trauma and toxic stress. I'm sure that's a concept and concern familiar to many of you, but we just want to highlight it here as we do have an increased understanding of the impact of trauma and toxic stress on the brain. And of course, this factor connects up, as almost all of them do, sort of like interconnecting puzzle pieces, to Susan's point about social connections, that this development and changes that are going adolescents experience are really enhanced when they have stable, caring, lasting, positive relationships that go with them through this process. This next slide has some of my favorite images in it, but it's a very full slide. So we're going to be on this slide for a little while, talking in a little bit more depth about what's going on with the brain. So there is so much to say about adolescent brain development and the changes, physical, hormonal, emotional, that go on during adolescence, that quite a few scholars have recently written really thoughtful books on this topic, and I'm not going to try to summarize all of that here. But I did want to highlight just one aspect of brain development, because I think if you look at one component of brain development, it can sometimes get people interested in taking a deeper dive into this information. And that's the rabbit and turtle image in the upper left corner here. So this really, I think, gives us all a lot of insight into why adolescents act the way they do and why we acted the way we did when we were adolescents. This image is really part of that answer. So the prefrontal cortex is the turtle, it's the tortoise, and that's the part of the brain that controls planning, impulse control, getting organized, setting priorities, making decisions, controlling yourself, regulating yourself. And that part of the brain matures gradually. And honestly, it isn't fully developed until age 26. At the same time, simultaneously during adolescence, we have the rabbit, the limbic system. That controls such things as emotionality, reward-seeking, pleasure-seeking, risk-taking, and all of that social information and social interaction. And it is this gap in timing of the gradual, slow and steady prefrontal cortex maturation mapped against the much more rapidly leaping ahead developing limbic system that is responsible for the kind of often infuriating, sometimes bewildering behavior that has vexed parents since the beginning of time. I would just highlight an example, as Susan has been doing, from one of the sites that Youth Thrive has been working with now for a couple of years, which is in Florida, the Brevard Family Partnership. And that's one of the communities that has really been a front runner in trying to ensure that youth in care have normal opportunities and experiences. Brevard's motto is don't say no, N-O, until you know, K-N-O-W. What they have done is really promulgated a host of policies and directives. They've established a decision-making process. They've created new staff positions, all with a shared purpose of really dispelling the myths, and they call them myths, and overcoming obstacles and barriers to youth having age-appropriate experiences. And those might be participating in community activities without requiring everyone involved to have a background check, traveling out of state with friends or family if you have the chance to go to sleepover camp or a weekend retreat, just being able to stay over at a friend's house for the night or use social media. And so they've really crafted a whole host of ways to try to promote those normal activities. Moving now to the lower left quadrant of this busy slide, we would be remiss if we didn't give a little bit more attention to our growing understanding of the impact of trauma on brain development. as Susan indicated, we know that frequent and prolonged stress and adversity, especially without adequate support and resources, often outside of the control of a young person, can really disrupt healthy brain development and make individuals much more vulnerable to illness and to chronic health problems, as has been documented in the ACEs study, and it can just contribute to multiple negative outcomes. So I wanted to just highlight here one of the exemplary initiatives, St. A's, which is a child welfare program in Wisconsin that has made a really deep commitment to being trauma-informed. And I think that's a phrase that gets used a lot, and so sometimes it's helpful to put some very practical things around that. So, for example, at St. A's, all staff, not just direct service staff who interact with young people, but all staff, janitorial staff, kitchen staff, administrative staff, managerial employees, all go through in-depth training to understand trauma and its impact on youth and families. And they report that this training and new understanding on their part of the staff has really changed how everyone views their work. For example, maintenance staff now have a very different insight into why a young person might damage property. St. A's has also incorporated trauma-informed commitments into all of their job descriptions, which helps to create that culture that Catherine and Matt alluded to early in our call, where interactions with children, youth, and families are appropriate and empathic and in line with this overall mission of redressing trauma. St. A's also customizes their therapeutic responses so that they're not just relying on sort of talk counseling kinds of experiences to help youth. They have many opportunities for what they consider sensory-based interventions. So think about things like dance, like sports, like different kinds of fitness activities, even knitting or horseback riding, can all help young people address their own sense of self and their ability to regulate and to cope with their emotions and even resolve some of what they've been through in the past. In terms of results, which, as you can tell, Susan and I have been trying to seed these through our presentation, so far St. A's has been able to do a small study of a pilot of its trauma-informed care initiatives and found improvements in measures of trauma symptoms. And they're now in the midst of a much larger study, which is being conducted by the University of Wisconsin, with data analysis they hope completed this year. I get to move to my next slide. Okay. Our fourth protective and promotive factor is what we call concrete support in times of need. And by concrete here, we really are talking about those concrete necessities that everyone deserves in order to grow and thrive, as well as the more specialized services that meet the needs of individual young people. So think here about education, about housing, health care, mental health, income, and eventually employment, as well as the specific needs that pertain more typically to youth, like tutoring or career counseling, college counseling, as well as more intensive services or crisis assistance for a young person who may be struggling with substance abuse or may unfortunately have legal issues either related to the justice system or to their immigration status. So in terms of some examples about this, it's important that we think not just about those resources and services that young people need, but also about their own ability to ask for help and to learn that asking for help can be a real sign of strength and to get comfortable to enlisting others and helping them solve problems. This connects back up to Susan's point around resiliency. This is that set of skills that young people can practice and learn to be better at. So in terms of one of the programs I want to highlight around concrete support are two of the exemplary initiatives that were based at universities in Michigan. And Michigan, as some of you probably know, is a state that has made a major commitment to higher education opportunities for youth who have been in foster care. So if you think about college campuses generally, they are sort of concrete need factories for all of their students, right? They have residential life in the form of dorms. They have food services that operate, often around the clock. They have health centers that provide basic health needs. They often have transportation and recreation activities. So they are really concrete support factories. And if you look at a place like Michigan State University and Western Michigan University, where they have the Center for Fostering Success, these are schools that have made a deep commitment to ensuring a positive culture and positive experience for youth who were formerly in foster care. So it starts with that financial commitment. So at Western Michigan, they have committed more than $1.5 million in the form of scholarships for former foster youth. But they haven't only looked at the financial piece and then said, okay, now you're here, fend for yourself. Their center addresses a host of other concrete needs. So, for example, administrators, including the Director of Financial Aid, invite students to their home for the holidays so that young people who are living on campus have a place to go for holiday meals, over winter break, and are not left to fend for themselves during those times. The union on campus that's responsible for building and grounds has volunteered semester after semester to be there on move-in and move-out days to make sure that students, when they arrive with all of their belongings, have someone to help them physically get them into their dorm room and get everything set up so they're not sort of standing on the pavement without the family van, but have people there for them. And that has really been a very powerful bonding experience, and some very lasting relationships have formed out of what could be a stressful move-in and move-out experience. In addition, at Michigan State, former foster youth attend a special summer session to get oriented to the campus and prepare them for campus life. And they even think about small things like sending those youth care packages during final weeks. Again, to just highlight some results, the program at Western Michigan has grown the number of foster youth on campus from 12 in the spring of 2007 to enrolling over 160 former students who were formerly in foster care who are now enrolled annually. They've already had 63 graduates and a graduation rate that far exceeds the national rates for former foster youth in higher education. I'll also just mention the Next Generation Center, which is located in the Bronx in New York. It's a physical community center designed specifically to meet the needs of young people who are involved in the child welfare system. And in terms of concrete needs, there's tutoring, there's computers on site, there's a library, there's a music studio so young people can record music. They have employment and internship programs, including a culinary arts program that caters events all over the city. But they also really are attentive to how the supports within the center can help build those social connections and resilience that are those linked protective factors, and use restorative practices to make sure that young people understand the consequences of their behaviors, have those opportunities to take a misstep but learn for it, and can always continue to participate and belong, even if their behavior has been an issue in the past. They are not excluded from the center's activities. Okay, we are on to our, I think, our fifth and final protective and promotive factor, and it's cognitive and social emotional competence. So when you think of the cognitive part of this, I think we typically think of sort of academic skills, the things that you learn at school, the skills that you'll need to complete tasks at work, the kind of abilities that make you a good and productive member of your community. And the social emotional part of it, I often think of as the building of one's self factor. So it's self-awareness, self-concept, self-efficacy, self-esteem, all those great self-hyphenated terms. It's really that personal agency, that you can take responsibility for yourself, that you have positive feelings about yourself and your future, that you have some joy and some love, some hope and optimism in your life, that you have at least a few trusted friends and family members that have faith in you and your abilities over time. That's, in a nutshell, what we mean by cognitive and social emotional competence. I'm going to just go ahead and click in these other icons here that just give a little bit more detail there to the cognitive and social emotional competence, which encompasses executive functioning, as I mentioned, positive emotions, personal agency, all those characteristics of self, and that sense of a character trait. So in terms of highlighting particular program examples, on the cognitive side, I would mention foster ed, which operates in several states across the country. Because research has demonstrated that there's a strong correlation between adult involvement and educational success, foster ed ensures that each foster child has an educational champion. This champion is typically a parent or other family member, other concerned adult, and that adult champion is asked to communicate and trained to communicate effectively with teachers and other school staff. They help the young person navigate the school system, and they facilitate learning at home. In addition to this direct individual advocacy and work with families, Foster Ed collaborates with the larger child welfare system and school system, as well as the judiciary, to advocate for system-wide improvements to policies, practices, and infrastructure. So just as one example, Arizona created new judicial forms and court orders so that the educational champions are actually appointed by the judge as part of the family court proceeding. They've also made improvements to the state child welfare case management system so that the state agency can let schools know which children that are pupils in their classrooms are also in the child welfare system, and this enables them to do a better job of tracking their progress in school. On the social emotional side, I want to highlight the value of leadership opportunities that help young people develop the type of self-efficacy skills, well, that's a mouthful, and that sort of sense of self that is part of a culture that is all encompassed in this factor. So most states and counties now have youth advisory boards, or YABs as they're often referred to, and those boards give input on child welfare policy and make recommendations often directly to commissioners and very high-level staff in the child welfare agencies on how to improve services and procedures. And this gives youth leaders a chance not only to learn group dynamics, but also to just do very important activities such as how to run a meeting, how to conduct or lead a training, how to review a curriculum, how to organize and facilitate community service activities that would give youth themselves a chance to contribute to their neighborhoods and peers in meaningful ways. So those kind of leadership opportunities can be a very powerful way to build in these cognitive and social emotional competencies within youth. Susan, I'm turning it back to you.
Thanks, Francie. One of the things, before I get to the slide, one of the things that I hope was clear from hearing from Francie and me talk about the protective and promotive factors is how they interact with one another. It's not just about, oh, we're going to put all our efforts into, helping to young people to build their resilience. It's the interaction between all five that really is going to make the biggest difference towards helping us to achieve those dynamic outcomes that we want for young people. So, the presence of a caring adult, which you could say is part of social connections, that caring adult is so instrumental to helping a young person develop their resilience. Having someone be there to help a young person interpret what's going on with themselves in their brain through their development in puberty is also critical. So it shows the interaction between social connections and knowledge of adolescent development. They're all of the five protective and promotive factors reinforce each other, and that's why they act as a framework for achieving well-being. So the rest of the presentation is going to look at additional practice and policy strategies. I mean, obviously, Francie and I both have tried to talk about and sort of pepper with, throughout our talk about the five protective factors with examples from our exemplary initiatives from some of the states what we have been working with, but we have some additional ones that we want to share with you. And we're committed, CSSP, I mean, it's part of our mission, is committed to helping public agencies, achieve systems change and for rethinking their, the levers, these levers of change, all with the goal of improving outcomes for youth in public systems, involved in public systems. So let's start by thinking about some additional implications for practice. Our work with youth has to be driven by an understanding of adolescent development and the impact of trauma. You've heard that from Francie, from me throughout. I think we all know this. We need to be authentic in our relationships with youth, to enjoy them and to nurture them because our relationship with them is so key. And we need to use techniques that involve them in authentic decision-making about their lives and that allow them to learn from mistakes and make their own choices. They need to be provided with experiences that encourage positive risk-taking, things like trying out for a sports team or, applying for a job so that they're less likely to be drawn to more dangerous risk-taking behavior. And our practice needs to encourage team building with youth, not just because we know it's good practice, but because through team building, through building teams around them, involving them in creating their own teams. We're helping to build their social networks. And practice has to be culturally humble and relevant and assertive in confronting and breaking down the barriers to access based on inequities. The work that you're all doing is among the most important work in society. You're helping our country's most vulnerable young people to be able and to be ready to navigate the broader world and the adult world. And they need our help and they need your help in helping them to think about their contribution to society, what's important to them, what they value and what they believe in. They need experiences that are driven by their interests, which means that we need to know what those interests are. We need to be asking what those interests are. We need to be pulling it out of them so that we can give them opportunities to excel. They need to be given an opportunity to explore their different identities, including their cultural identity, their racial identity, their sexual orientation and gender identity, which means that our youth programs need to reflect that diversity in staffing. Our offices need to reflect that diversity through decorations and artwork, and that our staff themselves have to be comfortable in asking and helping a young person to talk about these various identities that influence and impact their daily lives. Youth need to be challenged to try new experiences. And as professionals, we need to bring very high expectations as to what they can accomplish so that they have high expectations for themselves. We need to help them to reach for the stars, and we need to tell them that we have confidence in them and show it to them. So some of the additional strategies needed to bring Youth Thrive to life. Francie already talked about the use of youth advisory boards to help youth find and use their voice. But I want to just stop here for a minute and talk about that a little bit further. Youth in foster care and juvenile justice systems are on the receiving end of pretty much everything that influences their lives. We tell them where they are going to live, where they go to school, what rules they need to follow, etc. And one of the signs of healthy development is the ability to be constructively engaged in school or community through volunteering, giving back, or holding a job. And you need to know, and especially, I think, all the youth, but I think especially youth in foster care and juvenile justice who have experienced incredible adversity in their lives, need to know that we believe that they have something to contribute. And that youth advisory boards are a great way to show them that their voice matters, and it provides them an opportunity to give back to others. I've already spoken about how youth need to play a key voice in planning for their transition, but we also need to make sure that youth needs for health care and mental health services are met, and that everyone can take advantage of Medicaid to 26 through automatic enrollment in Medicaid, and by ensuring that residency requirements don't set up unreasonable barriers to coverage. Our contract language should be requiring contractors to address how they're building social capital, resiliency, and competencies in youth, and how their staff are trauma-informed and knowledgeable about adolescent development and the protective and promotive factors that help youth to thrive. And this all has to be reinforced through leadership commitment, the use of data, a robust service array, community partnerships that can address the totality of what we mean when we talk about well-being. That it involves their health, it involves their academic success, it involves their social health, it involves just a myriad of dimensions that we're going to need to bring community partners on board with us in order to be able to address that complexity of what we mean by well-being. We need staff training and good supervision and accountability systems that hold people accountable for practicing what we know about healthy youth development. One of the resources that, one of the recent resources that CSSP developed is a searchable database, which you can find on our website, that lays out both sort of big and small ideas and suggestions for operationalizing the Youth Thrive framework. It includes such suggestions as redefining what constitutes critical incidents so that they're more in sync with what we know about adolescent limit testing. It addresses the use of electronic media to connect youth and encouraging opportunities for youth to engage in pro-social activities. The suggestions can be searched by specific protective factors. So for example, if you're interested in seeing all the ideas on resilience, you could input resilience and the strategies will pop up. Or if you want to see the strategies related to applying a Youth Thrive lens within out-of-home care, you can input out-of-home care, and those strategies will show up. And obviously, as you can imagine, this is a work in progress, and we hope that agencies will send us ideas for inclusion in the database going forward. So, looking ahead, we have just, in the last month or two, began working with youth and systems beyond child welfare. Many of the 5 new jurisdictions that we're working in addition to New Jersey and Brevard, Florida, many of them are reaching to youth not only in the foster care system, but youth involved that have dual involvement in both juvenile justice and mental health, youth that are at risk of foster care, as Catherine talked about, through the federal agenda around trying to prevent and reduce homelessness among foster youth. So they're reaching into other systems. And we're developing a range of resources for judges, GALs, parents and youth attorneys, developing a toolkit for kinship resource parents, a validated youth of self-assessment instrument that I mentioned previously, and skill-building training specific to each of the protective factors, which will augment the 3-day Train the Trainer curriculum that I also mentioned. And this training is really geared towards helping workers and supervisors go deeper into the how of building the protective factor, the protective and promotive factors. So in conclusion, I wanted to just talk to you about some additional resources that you might find interesting, because CSSP runs a number of other relevant national initiatives and have produced many resources that are relevant to child welfare system change efforts and to youth service delivery. So our Get Real initiative is making resources available on how to ask questions about sexual orientation and gender expression and identity, and how to create, affirming placements and programming for LGBTQ youth. Our work with expectant and parenting youth in foster care addresses meeting the developmental needs of the young person as both a young person, an adolescent, and also as a parent, and also addresses simultaneously how to help parents understand and promote the development of their babies, of their young children. And that work embodies very strongly a commitment to building the protective and promotive factors, reducing risk, and creating opportunities for family success. Our Strengthening Families work, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with and which has been picked up all over the country, addresses parental protective factors for families with young children. And our Alliance for Racial Equity in Child Welfare raises up strategies for reducing the disparate outcomes that Francie talked about that families of color experience within the child welfare system. And I encourage you to look at our website, both at the Youth Thrive website, but also on the websites for these initiatives to get more information. And each of these have national initiatives. Each of these national initiatives have networks that you can join so that you can learn more and be participating with them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and open it up for questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan and Francie. That was really great. So at this moment, I don't have any questions that have come up that need to be addressed in our Q&A feature. I would take this moment to remind everyone again that you do have the ability to ask them questions via writing in the Q&A box that you see at the right of the PowerPoint on your screen. And I also want to mention again that below the Q&A box is also a handouts box where you can click on and download right now resources that Francie and Susan have provided for this webinar, one of which is the PDF version of this PowerPoint. That's the one titled Youth Thrive PowerPoint. But then they also provided 3 other documents on resilience, protective and promotive factors, and building the Youth Thrive framework. And so what I actually believe, Meredith, how is it that they can get the operator to unmute them if they'd like to actually ask a question of Susan and Francie without typing it in?
And this is the operator, sir. To signal for a question over the phone line, please press *1 on your telephone keypad.
Great. And so to give a second for people maybe to get those in, one of the things that I was thinking before is, could you, Francie or Susan or both of you, maybe talk a little bit more about maybe what you've seen of any culture changes or factors that have changed in the places that you've worked with trying to implement the Youth Thrive framework?
Well, I can start. I mean, I think that obviously all of what we're working towards is a change in agency culture. And so what I think we end up seeing is workers, first of all, who now have quite a bit more information about adolescent development, about what they can do differently, and it excites them. And they're feeling, I think, a little bit more inspired in their work and also more eager because they have some tools about what they can do to try to help young people to succeed and to thrive. We've seen agency leaders who have really sort of encouraged and put forward their values about young people, really encouraged an emphasis on normalcy and made that an expectation within their agencies. Several, New Jersey and also Brevard, which are really the 2 places we've been working with the longest, they have expanded and made much more real the use of youth advisory boards throughout the state so that young people are being given an opportunity and a voice and are listened to as they think about developing strategies for putting these theories and these concepts into practice. Francie, do you want to?
Sure, I'll just build on that to say, culture can seem like one of those elusive qualities that is hard to, come up with that sort of checklist of how to change. And so I think the values and activities that Susan's speaking about really can be part of that culture change. I would also say that our experience has really shown us the wisdom of thinking about ways to involve young people themselves in almost every decision. So Susan alluded to the search activities that we undertook to identify these 15 exemplary initiatives, and we included young people on those site visits, and that was a very valuable experience for us, for the staff that went, to have them come along and be full participants, asking questions, observing the programs, watching the interactions with young people. And I think that same kind of strategy applies when you are thinking about training staff and selecting staff. So some of this really has to come about through a kind of commitment and really joy and passion for working with young people. And it's hard to see that if you don't ask an applicant to spend some time interacting with young people. So I think as much as you can try to stack the deck in favor of a youth supporting culture by finding people who really enjoy that interaction, get something out of it, handle it in a way that reflects the kind of respect and reciprocity that you're looking for, by making sure that that application and job-seeking set of activities involve young people in the kind of settings and places that you're going to want these staff to be working with them. So I would just add that as another way to go.
Great, thanks. We do have a question that came in through the Q&A box, and that's they want to know who can they contact directly to receive additional information on the 3-day TOT workshops, and do they do they travel to states to do it?
Okay, great question. Yeah, the answer is yes, they do travel. Yes, you can contact them. If you go to the CSSP website, there's an FAQ about the training curriculum, and it'll tell you where the training, it'll answer basic questions about what the training is, who is it meant for, et cetera. We're currently providing the training in the 7 jurisdictions that we're working with. So we are going to be doing Train the Trainer in those 7 states. But in addition, primarily Frank Eccles from the Academy for Competent Youth Workers does do these sort of regional trainings and charges a really minimal, basically just sort of making sure that the training, the costs are being covered of the materials. And I know that he does that a couple of times a year. So if you can contact either Francie or me, and we can put you in touch with Frank, unless you know how to reach him directly. I'm trying to think, Francie, does it give their addresses and their email contact on our website, do you know?
The FAQs about the training of trainers actually includes my email address, and I'll also type that into the chat box. I was just starting to do it as sort of the conduit to get information to them. We do also send out an occasional newsletter. We will not flood your inbox with lots of newsletters, but periodically send those out. And we'll often include information about any upcoming trainings that are open and where they're happening, and then the details to sign on to that. So I'll put my email in the chat box. People, please feel free to send me an email. We'll add you to the e-newsletter list, and then that's a way to hear about trainings as they get scheduled when there are opportunities for people to go.
And absolutely, both Frank and Jean, I believe, are open to being contacted to arrange for trainings in particular jurisdictions as well. So.
And for all the participants, we'll be putting up Susan, Francie, myself, and the CB contact information before the webinar ends as well. So if any of your questions deal with contact, you can ask really any question you'd like to after the webinar to any of us, and you'll have that soon. But that was a great question. Thank you.
And at this time, sir, I'm showing no questions or comments over the phone lines. Again, *1 to signal for a question over the phone line.
I don't see any questions either in our Q&A box.
Matt, it looks like I'm seeing a comment from somebody in Brevard who's a GAL there, and I just wonder if he wants to speak up to the group, who says, I'm a GAL in Brevard and has seen many positive results of the normalcy program, which is terrific to see that comment, but I wonder if he might want to share his experiences. You see that?
Yeah, Michael, if you do you feel like *1ing your phone and verbalizing your comment or experience with Youth Thrive?
And I do show one question over the phone line. Caller, your line is open. Please state your name and proceed.
Hi, this is Michael Bloom.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, I've been a guardian ad litem in Brevard for 7 years, so I was here before the normalcy program and have been here since. And the change in the positive attitude of the kids has been tremendous. Before the normalcy program, they felt like they were prisoners in their foster homes, and now it's afforded them overnights with friends. It's afforded them activities with school, sports games. The guardian ad litems are now allowed to transport the children. So the specific child I'm working with now, I can get him out of the foster house and get him some respite from the foster house itself. It's just been, it really has made a big difference for these kids. I can't stress enough how much of a positive result it's had. And there's so little here in Brevard. It really was nice for me to see Brevard recognized as a place where something groundbreaking and positive is happening.
Great.
What county is that in Florida, Michael?
It's Brevard County.
Oh, it's in Brevard County. Okay.
Yes, we're due east of Orlando, near the Kennedy Space Center. So Titusville, Melbourne, and Palm Bay would be our three biggest cities in the county. But we cover an area about the size of the state of Rhode Island. So we have a lot of logistic problems with servicing the kids in care. Many of our contractors and agencies have to have three locations, a north, central, and south, because we're 79 miles long, the county.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your feedback and comment.
Yeah, I'm real interested in the Get Real program. I'll be shooting Francie an email, seeing if there's something, if that's already been started in Brevard. If not, I'd like to be part of that.
Great. We will be happy to share. They actually have some new resources that have been developed, and I think that's really terrific to hear about your on-the-ground experience there, and that's something we need to think more about. Susan, I don't know if you want to say anything further about Get Real.
No, I don't. I think that, first of all, they have fabulous materials, and so you can find an awful lot on our website. And their network is excellent. They're a very robust and active network of sending out materials all the time. So check it out.
And at this time, I'm showing no additional questions or comments over the phone lines.
I don't have any here on my end either. Give it a few more seconds, but I guess Francie and Susan, do you have any last minute comments, or we can give people a few minutes of their afternoon back too?
No, we just appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about this.
Sure. So again, not only thank you to everyone who decided to come and join this webinar today, we really appreciate that, but also, from the Center for States, we very much appreciate the work Susan and Francie have done to get this presentation together with us. We definitely think that the Youth Thrive curriculum is a really excellent example of what can be done to integrate a lot of the terms and trainings and knowledge that have been gained over the last couple of decades into a curriculum, and also training that really benefit, our work with youth. And so for anybody that has any questions about the brief center and collaborative information that I went over in the beginning, or CSSP, here's who I would recommend contacting, and that's myself, Matthew Hudson, at the Center for States, and that's just matthew.hudson@icfi.com. If you're looking to reach Susan Notkin, you can reach her at susan.notkin@cssp.org. If you're looking for Francie, you can reach her at francie.zimmerman@cssp.org. And if you're looking to reach out to CB, Catherine Heath is who did the introduction a little bit ago. But if you'd like to reach out to CB, you can also reach out to Jane Morgan. That's jane.morgan@acf.hhs.gov. And we got a nice message from another person that says, thank you all for today's webinar. Thank you to Carmen. And with that, thank you to everybody who was a participant, and we hope to hear from you in the future. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude today's conference. We'd like to thank everyone for their participation. You may now disconnect.